I'm Colonel Rita Garrett, 38 years old, and I built my career briefing generals at the Pentagon after coming up from a small Virginia town. For years, I covered for my father, sending money, making introductions, even letting him ride the glow of my achievements. But the morning I walked into a top-secret briefing, my phone buzzed with a text from my mom: "Your father sold you out. Run." Minutes later, the general pointed at me and said, "Seize her, she's a traitor." Have you ever been betrayed by the person you trusted most? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about drawing boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next changed everything. I learned discipline before I learned to tie my shoes. By 6, I was making my bed with hospital corners. By 12, I could field strip a rifle faster than most adults could load one. My father called it building character, though looking back, I think he was building something else entirely. Dad was career Army until a training accident took his knee and his commission. After that, he became one of those men who lived through other people's achievements, measuring his worth in reflected glory. He'd corner neighbors at barbecues, telling them about his daughter who had what it took to make something of herself in uniform. Mom watched from the kitfu window, drawing the same plate over and over while Dad lectured me on the importance of excellence. She'd catch my eye sometimes and offer a small smile, the kind that said she understood what he couldn't see, that I was already excellent, just not in the ways he was looking for. I threw myself into everything. Honor roll, ROTC, track team, debate club. Every achievement was currency I could trade for his approval, every success proof that his investment in my discipline was paying dividends. When I earned a full ROTC scholarship to Virginia Tech, he threw a party and invited half the neighborhood. I remember standing in our backyard, watching him accept congratulations like he'd earned the scholarship himself. Takes a special kind of father to raise a daughter like that, I heard him tell our neighbor, Mr. Peterson. Not everyone has the backbone to push their kids the way they need to be pushed. Mom squeezed my shoulder. "He's proud of you," she said quietly. But pride and recognition weren't the same thing, and even at 18, I knew the difference. The military gave me what home couldn't, a place where merit mattered more than politics, where your last name meant less than your last fitness report. I excelled in ways that had nothing to do with Dad's expectations and everything to do with my own drive. Leadership came naturally. Strategy felt like breathing. By 25, I was fast-tracked for advanced intelligence training. By 30, I was briefing colonels who'd been in service since before I was born. Dad loved this part. Every promotion meant phone calls to relatives, updates on Facebook, casual mentions at the VFW about his daughter, who was making waves in DC. He'd call me after each advancement, not to congratulate me, but to tell me who he'd told about it. "Your Aunt Linda says she's not surprised," he'd say. "I told her you got that drive from me." The money started flowing early. First, it was small things, helping with Mom's medical bills when she had her gallbladder surgery, covering the roof repair after the storm, sending extra cash for Christmas. Dad never asked directly, but his hints were clear enough. A comment about how expensive everything was getting, a mention of how other military families helped their parents, a joke about how successful daughters should take care of the people who made them successful. I sent what I could. Not just money, but opportunities. When Dad mentioned a friend who was looking for government contract work, I made introductions. When he wanted to attend a military charity dinner, I got him tickets. When he asked if I could arrange a tour of the Pentagon for some business associates, I pulled strings I probably shouldn't have pulled. Each favor came with a price I didn't recognize at the time. Dad would tell people he had connections in Washington, that he could open doors for the right opportunities. He'd name-drop my position in conversations, using my security clearance as his calling card. I told myself it was harmless. Fathers were supposed to be proud of their children. Mom saw it differently. During one of my rare visits home, she pulled me aside while Dad was in the garage showing off the new tools I'd helped him buy. "He's getting too comfortable with this," she said, folding laundry with the same precision Dad had taught me to apply to everything. "People are starting to call the house, asking about contracts, about meetings." He's making promises he can't keep. What kind of promises? She looked toward the garage, where we could hear Dad explaining the technical specifications of his new drill press to nobody in particular. The kind that involve you. I should have listened. Should have drawn lines then, while they still could have been drawn cleanly. Instead, I told myself Mom was worrying over nothing. Dad was just enjoying his connection to something important, something bigger than his small world of disability checks and afternoon television. But the signs were there. The way he'd steer conversations toward my work. The questions that pushed just past the edge of what I could appropriately answer. The suggestions that maybe I could arrange this meeting or facilitate that introduction. The slow transformation from proud father to something else entirely. At family gatherings, he'd hold court, telling stories about his connections in ways that made it sound like he was the one with the clearance, the access, the authority. He'd interrupt when I tried to correct him, dismiss my attempts to set boundaries as false modesty. She doesn't like to talk about the important stuff she does, he'd tell cousins and uncles. National security, you understand. But she's right in the thick of things. Right where I always knew she'd be. The worst part wasn't the exaggeration or even the credit-taking. It was the way he'd look at me afterward, expecting gratitude for his public praise, as if his version of my life was a gift he was giving me. I kept sending money, kept making introductions, kept believing that underneath the bluster and the name-dropping was the man who'd taught me to make hospital corners and field strip rifles, who'd pushed me to be excellent even when he couldn't see that I already was. Mom's warnings got quieter but more frequent. Little comments about phone calls from strangers, about Dad's new friends who seemed very interested in his Pentagon connections. About conversations she'd overheard that made her uncomfortable, but that she couldn't quite explain. I was too busy proving myself in briefing rooms and situation rooms to pay attention to the situation developing in my childhood home. Too focused on earning the respect of generals and intelligence officials to notice that my father was trading on that respect in ways I never would have authorized. Looking back, I can see the moment everything started to unravel. It wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no breaking point. Just a phone call from Dad, thanking me for helping his friends secure a consulting contract, talking about how grateful people were for the family connection. What family connection? I asked. You know, he said. Your position. Your access. People appreciate having someone on the inside. That should have been the moment. The conversation that set boundaries, established limits, made clear what was appropriate and what crossed lines I couldn't let him cross. Instead, I said nothing. Changed the subject. Told myself I was reading too much into it. 3 months later, I was walking into the most important briefing of my career, and my phone was buzzing with a message that would destroy everything I'd spent my life building. The change in Dad didn't happen overnight. Like most disasters, it developed slowly, with warning signs I chose not to see until it was too late to course correct. By the time I made Lieutenant Colonel, Dad's attitude had shifted from pride to ownership. He no longer talked about being proud of my achievements, he talked about his investment in my success, as if my rank and clearance were assets in his portfolio. 20 years I put into that girl, he'd tell anyone who'd listen. 20 years of discipline and direction. You don't get to where she is by accident. The requests became more specific. Instead of asking for help with bills, he'd ask for introductions to specific contractors. Instead of general questions about my work, he'd probe for details about upcoming procurements, personnel changes, strategic priorities. When I deflected, he'd frame it as disappointing him, as if my unwillingness to discuss classified information was a personal slight. I'm not asking for state secrets, he'd say. I'm asking my daughter to help her old man understand the world she works in. But understanding wasn't what he was after. Dad had discovered that his connection to me opened doors that had been closed to him since his medical discharge 20 years earlier. Suddenly, people returned his calls. Contractors wanted to buy him lunch. Former colleagues who'd stopped including him in their circles were interested in his opinions again. He'd started telling people he was a consultant, though when I asked what he was consulting on, his answers were vague. Strategy, he'd say. Government relations. You know, helping people navigate the system. Mom tried to warn me during a visit home for Christmas. We were in the Kitfu, preparing dinner while Dad held court in the living room with 3 men I didn't recognize. Their conversation was loud enough for us to hear, talk about defense contracts, about inside information, about knowing the right people in the right places. "He's gotten in with a new crowd," Mom said quietly, checking the turkey with movements that seemed more nervous than necessary. "They come by the house, call at all hours. They ask a lot of questions about you." "What kind of questions?" "About your job. About who you work with. About whether you might be interested in meeting with them sometime." I looked through the kit food doorway at the men in our living room. They had the polished look of DC operators, expensive suits, practiced handshakes, the kind of confident demeanor that came from knowing how to work the angles. Dad was animated in a way I hadn't seen since his military days, gesturing with his beer bottle, speaking in the clipped, authoritative tone he'd used when he was still wearing the uniform. "He tells them you owe everything to him," Mom continued. "That without his guidance, his connections, his introduction to the right people, you never would have gotten where you are." This was news to me. Dad's connections, when I was growing up, had been limited to other enlisted men at the VFW and neighbors who worked at the hardware store. The idea that he'd somehow opened doors for me in Washington was pure fiction, but apparently fiction he'd started believing. "They want to meet you," Mom said. "These men. They keep asking when you'll be home for a visit, whether Dad could arrange an introduction. He keeps telling them it's just a matter of timing." I should have confronted him then. Should have walked into that living room and made clear that whatever he was telling these people, whatever promises he was making, he needed to stop immediately. Instead, I stayed in the kitfu, helping Mom with dinner, telling myself that Dad's new friends were probably harmless. The warning signs multiplied over the following months. Dad would call with increasingly specific questions about Pentagon personnel, about contract timelines, about strategic initiatives that hadn't been made public yet. When I reminded him that I couldn't discuss such things, he'd act hurt, as if my adherence to security protocols was evidence that I no longer trusted him. "I raised you better than that," he'd say. "I taught you the importance of loyalty, of taking care of family. Now you're too good to help your old man understand what's happening in his own government." The guilt was effective. I started sharing more than I should have, nothing classified, but context and background that could be valuable to someone who knew how to use it. General information about personnel moves, about budgetary priorities, about the kinds of capabilities the military was looking to develop. Information that was technically public, but that took experience to interpret correctly. Dad would listen with the intensity of a man taking notes, asking follow-up questions that seemed innocent but that pressed for specifics I couldn't provide. After each conversation, I'd feel like I'd been debriefed rather than catching up with family. The money flow increased too. Dad's requests became more frequent and more substantial. The roof repair became a full renovation. The medical bills expanded to include procedures that weren't emergencies, but that he presented as urgent. He started talking about investment opportunities that required capital he didn't have, about business ventures that could pay off big if he could just get the initial funding. "It's not just about me," he'd say when I hesitated. "It's about building something for the whole family. Something that could set us all up for the long term." But the ventures always seemed to involve his new friends, the men with expensive suits and vague job descriptions. And they always seemed to require more information than I was comfortable providing, not classified information, he'd always assure me, just insights that could help them make better business decisions. I was sending him $2,000 a month by then, money I couldn't really afford on a military salary. But Dad had a way of making his requests seem reasonable, even necessary. He'd frame them as investments in our family's future, as recognition of the debt I owed for the foundation he'd provided. "Without me, where would you be?" he'd ask. "Some suburban housewife, probably. Maybe a teacher or a nurse if you were lucky. I'm the one who pushed you to be more than that. I'm the one who made sure you had the discipline to succeed." It was a narrative that cast every achievement as his victory, every success as validation of his methods. In his version of events, my security clearance was something he'd earned, my position was something he'd made possible, my access was something he was entitled to share. Mom's attempts to intervene became more direct. She started calling me separately, usually when Dad was out with his new friends, warning me about conversations she'd overheard, about documents she'd found in his office, about promises he was making that involved me. "He's telling people you'll take meetings," she said during one call. "That you'll provide consulting services. He's got business cards made up with your name on them, listing him as your representative." "What kind of business cards?" "Government relations. Strategic consulting. It says you're available for private sector advisory work, with all inquiries to go through him." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Mom, you need to tell him to stop." "I can't. I've never authorized anything like that. If the wrong people see those cards, if word gets back to my command, I've tried," she said. "He tells me I don't understand the business world, that this is how things work in Washington. He says you're wasting opportunities by being too rigid about regulations." But I wasn't being rigid about regulations. I was trying to maintain the integrity that had gotten me where I was, the trust that my superiors had placed in me, the clearance that was the foundation of my entire career. Dad didn't see it that way. In his mind, my position was a resource to be leveraged, my access was capital to be invested, my connections were assets to be monetized. He'd spent his entire adult life feeling like opportunities had passed him by, and now he had a chance to reclaim some of what he felt the world owed him. The tragedy was that I understood his hunger. I'd grown up watching him struggle with the transition from military to civilian life, seeing him diminished by jobs that didn't use his skills or recognize his experience. Part of me wanted to help him feel important again, to give him access to the world I'd found after leaving his house. But I was beginning to understand that his vision of help and mine were fundamentally different. He wanted me to be his entry point into a world of influence and opportunity. I wanted him to be proud of what I'd accomplished on my own. The distance between those two desires was about to destroy everything I'd spent my life building. The briefing was scheduled for 0800 hours. By 07:55, I was walking through the Pentagon's corridors with the kind of focused calm that came from years of high-stakes situations. This wasn't just another intelligence update. This was the kind of meeting that shaped policy, the kind of room where decisions got made that would echo through theaters of operation around the world. I'd earned my place at that table. 3 tours overseas, 2 commendations for exceptional service, a track record of analysis that had prevented at least one international incident from escalating beyond diplomatic channels. My clearance was pristine, my reputation solid, my standing with the intelligence community unquestioned. My phone was on silent, but I felt it vibrate as I approached the conference room. Standard protocol was to check messages before entering secure areas, so I glanced at the screen expecting routine communication from my aide or perhaps a scheduling update. Instead, I saw a text from Mom. "Check your father's account. He sold you out. Run." The words didn't make sense. I read them again, standing in the hallway outside one of the most secure conference rooms in the building, trying to process what my mother was telling me. My father's account, his bank account? His social media? Some kind of business account I didn't know about? And what did she mean by "sold you out"? I looked up from the phone to see Colonel Martinez approaching, nodding his acknowledgement as he passed me to enter the briefing room. Other attendees were arriving, intelligence officials, strategic planners, a handful of civilians I recognized from previous meetings but couldn't name. I should have followed protocol. Should have turned around, left the building, called Mom back to understand what she was talking about before proceeding with anything involving classified information. But the briefing was starting, these people were expecting me, and surely Mom was overreacting to something minor. I silenced my phone and entered the room. General Patterson was already at the head of the table, reviewing his notes while the rest of us took our seats. He was old-school military, Silver Star, Purple Heart, the kind of commander who'd earned respect through decades of sound judgment and uncompromising integrity. I'd briefed him before, and he'd always treated me with the professional courtesy that came with competence rather than rank. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began once we were all seated, "this morning we're addressing intelligence gaps in Eastern European theater operations, with particular focus on supply chain vulnerabilities and contractor oversight." Standard stuff. The kind of strategic analysis that was my specialty, the kind of meeting where my input was valued and expected. I opened my portfolio and prepared to contribute to what should have been a routine intelligence review. But General Patterson wasn't looking at his notes anymore. He was looking at me. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before, "we need to address a security concern that's come to our attention." The room went quiet. This wasn't part of the agenda. Security concerns were handled through separate channels, not announced in strategic briefings. I looked around the table, seeing confusion on some faces, knowing looks on others. General Patterson stood up, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of command authority. "Seize her," he said, pointing directly at me. "She's a traitor." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. For a moment, nobody moved. Then training took over, and suddenly everyone was in motion except me. I sat frozen, still holding my portfolio, still trying to process what had just happened. Two security personnel who must have been waiting outside moved quickly to flank my chair. Colonel Martinez, who'd nodded politely to me in the hallway 5 minutes earlier, was now looking at me with something between disappointment and disgust. "There must be some mistake," I said, finding my voice, but hearing how thin it sounded. "General Patterson, I don't understand." "Stand up, Colonel," one of the security officers said. Not Lieutenant Colonel, which was my rank, but just Colonel, the kind of formal address that created distance, that marked me as something separate from the collegial atmosphere I'd thought I was walking into. I stood, legs unsteady, portfolio falling from my hands to scatter papers across the conference table. Strategic assessments, intelligence summaries, classified analyses, documents that represented months of work, that demonstrated my value to operations. These people would now continue without me. "Sir," I tried again, addressing General Patterson directly. "I need to understand what this is about. What am I supposed to have done?" But he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was addressing the room, speaking as if I'd already been removed. "We'll reconvene once this situation is resolved," he said. "Colonel Martinez will distribute updated materials reflecting the personnel change." Personnel change. As if my removal was administrative rather than catastrophic, as if 20 years of service could be erased with a simple roster modification. The security officers were professional but firm, guiding me toward the door with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first time removing someone from a classified briefing. As we walked past the table, I saw colleagues I'd worked with for years avoiding eye contact, some studying their phones, others suddenly finding their notes intensely interesting. Only Major Owens looked directly at me, and what I saw in her expression was something worse than anger or disappointment. It was pity. In the hallway, the world felt different. The same corridors I'd walked confidently for years now seemed hostile, full of people who might know something I didn't, who might be looking at me with new understanding about who I really was. My phone buzzed again, another message from Mom, but the security officers weren't giving me time to check it. "Ma'am," one of them said as we walked toward the elevator, "we need you to surrender your credentials and any classified materials in your possession." I handed over my badge, my portfolio, the secure phone I used for classified communications. Each item felt like a piece of my identity being stripped away, evidence of a life and career that had apparently been based on some fundamental misunderstanding. In the elevator, I finally had a moment to think about Mom's text. "He sold you out." Past tense, as if whatever Dad had done was already complete, already irreversible. As if while I'd been sitting in meetings and writing reports and building a career based on trust and competence, he'd been somewhere else, making different kinds of deals. The elevator doors opened onto a floor I'd never been to before, one that housed administrative functions I'd never needed to access. Internal affairs, personnel security, the kind of offices where careers went to die quietly, processed through bureaucratic procedures designed to minimize publicity and maximize control. As we walked down another hallway toward another room where I'd have to explain things I didn't understand to people who'd already decided I was guilty of something, I finally understood what Mom had been trying to tell me. Dad hadn't just taken credit for my achievements. He hadn't just leveraged my position for social status or business connections. He'd actually sold information, actual intelligence, to people who had no right to it. He'd used my name, my access, my reputation as currency in transactions that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with personal profit. And somehow, he'd made it look like I was involved. The security officer stopped at a door marked Personnel Security Office and gestured for me to enter. Inside was a room that looked like every interrogation space I'd ever seen: plain table, uncomfortable chairs, recording equipment, the kind of sterile environment designed to make people uncomfortable enough to tell the truth. Except I didn't know what the truth was yet. I only knew that whatever my father had done, whatever promises he'd made or information he'd sold, he destroyed my career in the process. As I sat down across from investigators who would spend the next several hours trying to determine whether I was a traitor or just the daughter of one, I realized that Mom's text had been wrong about one thing. It was already too late to run. The interrogation room had no windows and fluorescent lighting that made everything look sickly. I'd been sitting across from Agent Bennett and Agent Fu for 3 hours, answering the same questions in different variations while they built a timeline that made me look like either a spy or a fool. "Let's go through this again," Bennett said, consulting notes that seemed to grow thicker with each repetition. "Your father, Thomas Garrett, has been passing classified information to defense contractors for the past 18 months. Information that could only have come from someone with your level of clearance. I never gave my father classified information. But you did provide him with context about Pentagon operations. Background information about personnel changes, procurement priorities, strategic initiatives. This was the trap I'd walked into with every phone call home, every attempt to help Dad understand the world I worked in. Information that was technically unclassified, but that could be valuable to someone who knew how to use it. General information," I said. "Nothing that wasn't already available through public channels." "Public channels that required expertise to interpret," Fu added. "Expertise that your father didn't have, but that his associates did." They showed me photographs then. Dad at restaurants with men I didn't recognize, Dad at golf courses with people whose expensive clothes suggested they weren't paying with disability benefits, Dad in what looked like office settings that were definitely not our family home. Recognize any of these individuals? I didn't, but I was beginning to understand the scope of what Dad had built around my position. These weren't casual acquaintances or VFW buddies. These were professionals, people who understood the value of inside information and had the resources to pay for it. Your father told these people he could provide strategic intelligence about Pentagon operations, Bennett continued. He specifically claimed that his daughter, you, was his source inside the building. That's not true. But you did send him money. Substantial amounts. They had bank records. Transfers from my account to his, documented over 2 years, totaling more than $40,000. Money I'd sent for medical bills, home repairs, what I'd thought were legitimate family emergencies. Money that allowed him to maintain the lifestyle necessary to credibly claim he had access to classified information, Fu said. Money that funded his operation. I wanted to argue, to explain that the money was for Mom's medical expenses, for keeping their house from falling apart, for helping parents who'd given me the foundation for my career. But sitting in that sterile room, listening to agents deconstruct every good intention I'd had, I could see how it looked from the outside. My phone, which they'd returned after downloading its contents, buzzed with another message from Mom. This time they let me read it. "Your father took money from contractors. Promised them information about upcoming procurements. Used your name as guarantee. I have proof. I'm sorry." The proof arrived an hour later. Photos Mom had taken of documents in Dad's home office. Contracts with consulting companies I'd never heard of. Payment schedules tied to information delivery. Business cards with my name listed as strategic consultant and Dad listed as executive representative. Most damning of all, a memo Dad had written to one of his clients, summarizing intelligence briefings I'd supposedly provided about Eastern European military operations, complete with details that could only have come from classified briefings. Briefings I'd never discussed with him. Information I'd never shared with anyone outside authorized channels. "How do you explain this?" Bennett asked, sliding the memo across the table. I couldn't. The details were accurate information from meetings I'd attended, assessments I'd contributed to, strategic evaluations that were definitely classified. But I'd never told Dad any of it. I'd been careful, maybe too careful, about maintaining operational security even with family. Someone else had access to this information, I said finally. Someone else with your security clearance? Someone else who attended the same briefings you attended? I don't know. But it wasn't me. They let me call Mom from the interrogation room. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with a kind of controlled emotion that suggested she'd been crying. I found everything, she said before I could speak. All the contracts, all the payments. He's been recording your phone calls. The world shifted again. Every conversation I'd had with Dad over the past year, every casual discussion about work pressures or challenging assignments, every moment I'd shared frustrations about bureaucratic obstacles or difficult personalities, he'd been recording it all. How long? I asked. At least 2 years. Maybe longer. He has hours of recordings, organized by date, with notes about what you discussed. 2 years. Which meant he'd been planning this operation since before I'd made lieutenant colonel, since before his requests for money had become routine, since before I'd noticed any change in his behavior. Mom, why didn't you? I didn't know, she said, and I could hear her crying now. I knew something was wrong, but I thought it was just the bragging, just him trying to feel important again. I didn't know he was actually selling information. I didn't know he was recording you. After the call, Bennett and Fu gave me time to process what I'd learned. Time to understand that my father hadn't just betrayed me, he'd been systematically exploiting our relationship for profit, turning every conversation into a business transaction, every family interaction into an intelligence-gathering operation. We believe you're a victim here, Bennett said when they returned. But we need to understand the full scope of your father's operation. We need your cooperation to identify what information was compromised and which contractors had access to it. Cooperation meant testifying against Dad. It meant providing evidence that would send him to federal prison. It meant acknowledging that I'd been manipulated by someone I'd trusted completely, someone I'd supported financially and emotionally even when I'd sensed something was wrong. What about my clearance? That depends on the investigation. Your security review will determine whether you exercised appropriate judgment in your communications with your father, whether you should have recognized the security risks earlier, whether I should have known that my own father was using me to commit espionage, whether the money I'd sent him, the information I'd shared, the access I'd facilitated made me complicit in his operation even if I'd been unaware of it. They returned me to my quarters that evening with instructions not to discuss the investigation with anyone, not to contact my father, not to leave the Washington area without authorization. My security clearance was suspended pending resolution of the case, which meant I couldn't access any classified materials, couldn't attend any strategic meetings, couldn't perform any of the duties that had defined my career for the past decade. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of 20 years of service, commendations, photographs, deployment mementos, professional development certificates, and tried to understand how completely my life had changed in a single day. The worst part wasn't the professional humiliation or even the legal jeopardy. It was the realization that every conversation with Dad over the past 2 years had been a lie, every expression of pride or support had been a manipulation, every family interaction had been a transaction in a business model I'd never known existed. He'd taken the trust between a father and daughter and monetized it. He'd turned my career into his commodity, my clearance into his capital, my achievements into his opportunities. And somehow, he'd made me an accomplice in my own destruction. The evidence took 3 days to assemble. Bank records showing payments from defense contractors to accounts Dad had opened in both our names. Audio files from recorded phone conversations where I'd mentioned upcoming personnel changes, budget discussions, strategic assessments. Documents he'd created that presented my casual observations as formal intelligence briefings. I worked with Agent Bennett to trace the information flow, identifying what Dad had taken from our conversations and how he'd packaged it for his clients. It was like watching myself through a funhouse mirror, everything recognizable, but distorted into something I'd never intended to create. He was sophisticated about it, Bennett admitted as we reviewed the timeline. Your father understood that raw information wasn't valuable without context. He used your background knowledge to provide analysis that his clients couldn't get anywhere else. The sophistication was what made it feel like such a complete betrayal. This wasn't an opportunistic grab for quick money. Dad had developed a business model around my position, creating systems to capture, process, and monetize every professional insight I'd shared with him. How much did he make? Bennett consulted his notes. Conservative estimate? $200,000 over 18 months. Possibly more. We're still tracking down all the accounts. $200,000. Nearly 5 times my annual military salary. Money he'd earned by selling information I'd given him for free, trusting that he was just a father trying to understand his daughter's world. The legal strategy became clear as the evidence accumulated. My cooperation with the investigation would demonstrate that I'd been an unwitting victim rather than a willing participant. Dad's recordings of our conversations would prove that I'd never knowingly provided classified information, that I'd been manipulated rather than recruited. But cooperation meant more than just providing evidence. It meant actively participating in the case against him, testifying about our relationship, explaining how he'd exploited my trust and affection for criminal purposes. "We need you to call him," Bennett said on the 4th day. "Recorded conversation, with our guidance. Get him to admit what he's done, acknowledge that you weren't aware of his operation. You want me to trick my own father into confessing. We want you to give him an opportunity to tell the truth, to acknowledge what he's put you through, to take responsibility for his choices." The call was scheduled for that afternoon, with agents monitoring from the next room and a script designed to elicit admissions without appearing coached. I sat in the same interrogation room where I'd learned the scope of Dad's betrayal, holding a phone that would either help clear my name or further destroy my relationship with the only family I'd ever known. Dad answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness he'd been using with me since childhood whenever he knew he was in trouble. "Hey, sweetheart. I've been hoping you'd call. This whole thing is just a misunderstanding, you know. Just a bunch of bureaucrats getting excited about nothing. Dad, I need you to tell me what you've been doing. The investigators have bank records, recordings of our conversations, contracts with your name on them. I need to understand what's been happening." A pause. Then the tone shifted, becoming more defensive. "What's been happening is I've been trying to build something for our family. Trying to use the connections we have to create opportunities for all of us. There's nothing wrong with that. You recorded my phone calls. I kept notes about our conversations, yes. Important information, the kind of insights that could help people make better business decisions. That's not recording, that's just being thorough." But the agents in the next room were holding up a sign that said they'd found the actual recording equipment in his house. Digital devices hidden in his home office, configured to automatically capture and store phone conversations. "Dad, they found the recording equipment. They have audio files of our conversations going back 2 years. Silence. Then the sound of him breathing, thinking, calculating his response. "Okay," he said finally. "Maybe I was more systematic about it than I should have been. But everything I did was about protecting you, about making sure our family benefited from all the work you've put into your career. You can't tell me that's wrong. You sold classified information. I shared insights with business partners. Information that helped them understand market conditions, strategic priorities. Nothing that wasn't already available if you knew how to interpret it. Information you got by recording my private conversations without my knowledge." Another pause. Longer this time. "You're my daughter," he said, and now his voice carried the edge of anger I'd heard throughout childhood whenever his authority was questioned. "Everything you know, everything you've accomplished, everything you have access to, that all came from me. From the foundation I built, the discipline I taught you, the opportunities one created." This was the heart of his justification. Not just that he'd earned some share of my professional success, but that my career was essentially his property, his creation, his to exploit as he saw fit. "The investigators say you made over $200,000. Money that could have helped secure our family's future. Money that could have paid for your mother's medical care, could have ensured we didn't become a burden on you as we got older. Money that represented a return on 20 years of investment in your development." He wasn't admitting guilt so much as explaining why he deserved to profit from my position. In his mind, my security clearance wasn't something I'd earned through my own merit and judgment. It was a family asset he was entitled to monetize. Dad, I could go to prison for this. My career is over. My security clearance has been suspended. That's temporary, he said, the dismissive tone he'd always used when I worried about consequences he didn't want to consider. Once they understand that you weren't involved, once they see that this was all about supporting family, they'll reinstate you. They need good officers like you. They think I was involved because you used my name on business cards, because you told people I was providing consulting services, because you created contracts that listed me as your intelligence source. Marketing materials, he said. You have to present things in ways that clients can understand. These people needed to know they were getting premium information, not just speculation from some old soldier. The casualness with which he discussed destroying my reputation was almost harder to bear than the betrayal itself. He turned my name into a brand, my career into his calling card, my professional integrity into his marketing strategy, and he saw nothing wrong with any of it. The recording equipment, Dad. Help me understand why you felt you needed to record our conversations. Insurance, he said immediately. Protection for both of us. If anyone ever questioned what information was shared and how, I'd have proof that everything was legitimate, that you never said anything you shouldn't have said. But the recordings proved the opposite. They documented 2 years of Dad systematically extracting professional insights from our conversations, taking my casual observations about workplace dynamics and packaging them as strategic intelligence for his clients. Did it occur to you that recording me without my knowledge was illegal? That using those recordings to create intelligence reports for defense contractors was espionage? Don't be dramatic, he said, and I could hear him moving around, probably pacing the way he did when he felt cornered. Espionage is what enemies do. This was family business, private sector consulting, helping American companies better understand how their government works. American companies that were bidding on classified contracts using information they got from you. Information that helped them serve their country more effectively. I don't see the problem. The problem was that he genuinely didn't see the problem. After 18 months of systematic information trafficking, after destroying my career and compromising national security operations, he still believed his actions were justified by his role as my father and his desire to finally cash in on the investment he'd made in my development. Mom says she tried to warn me. That she told you to stop. His voice hardened. Your mother doesn't understand business. She doesn't understand what it takes to succeed in the modern economy. She was content to let opportunities pass us by just because they required some creative thinking. Creative thinking. That's how he characterized recording his daughter's private conversations and selling the contents to defense contractors. Dad, I need you to tell me that you understand what you've done to me. That you understand my career is over, that I'm under investigation for espionage, that I could face federal charges. Your career isn't over, he said, the same patient tone he'd used when I was a child and worried about things he considered trivial. You're a good officer. You'll survive this. And when you do, you'll understand that everything I did was about protecting our family's interests. By destroying my security clearance? By making sure our family finally got some benefit from all the sacrifices we've made for your career. 20 years I've watched you give everything to the military while we struggled with medical bills, house payments, basic expenses. 20 years of putting the government ahead of your own family. There it was. The resentment he'd been carrying since my commissioning, the belief that my service was somehow a betrayal of family loyalty, that my dedication to duty was evidence that I'd forgotten where I came from. The money I sent you wasn't enough. Could never be enough. Not when you had access to information worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, connections worth millions, opportunities that could have set us up for life. The agents monitoring the call were making wrap-up gestures, indicating they'd gotten what they needed. But I had one more question, one that would determine whether any relationship with Dad could ever be salvaged. Do you understand that what you did was wrong? A long pause. Then, what I did was necessary. And if you weren't so blinded by regulations and protocol, you'd understand that family loyalty should come before institutional loyalty. That was his final answer. Not guilt, not remorse, not acknowledgement of the damage he'd caused. Just the conviction that he'd been right to exploit me, right to destroy my career, right to prioritize his financial interests over my professional integrity. When I hung up, Agent Bennett looked satisfied. That should be sufficient for the prosecution. He essentially admitted to the entire operation. But sufficient for prosecution wasn't the same as sufficient for understanding. Even with all the evidence, all the recordings, all the bank transfers, I still couldn't fully comprehend how the man who'd taught me about duty and honor had convinced himself that espionage was an act of family loyalty. The call had given me one thing, though: clarity about what I needed to do next. Dad had made his choice 18 months ago when he'd bought the first recording device. Now I had to make mine. I was going to testify against him. Not because the government demanded it, not because it was the only way to clear my name, but because after 20 years of trying to earn his approval, I finally understood that some relationships weren't worth preserving at any cost. The congressional hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. By then, the story had leaked to the Washington Post, Pentagon officer caught in family espionage ring, and my name was attached to the biggest intelligence scandal of the year. The article got most of the facts wrong, but the damage was done. Everyone in Washington now knew me as the officer who'd been compromised by her own father. My testimony was supposed to help distinguish between victim and perpetrator, but walking into that hearing room, I felt like I was on trial rather than serving as a witness. Banks of cameras, rows of reporters, congressional representatives who'd already formed opinions based on news coverage that painted me as either corrupt or incompetent. Dad sat at the defendant's table with 2 lawyers he couldn't afford, looking smaller than I remembered. He'd lost weight during the months leading up to the hearing, and the expensive suits his defense contractors had helped him buy no longer fit properly. When I entered the room, he looked at me with something between hope and accusation, as if my testimony might either save him or complete his destruction. Mom was in the gallery, wearing the same black dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral. She'd tried to visit Dad in detention, but he'd refused to see her, apparently convinced that she'd betrayed him by providing evidence to the investigators. In his mind, Mom's cooperation with the investigation was another example of family disloyalty, proof that no one understood the sacrifices he'd made for our financial security. I took the witness stand and swore to tell the truth, knowing that the truth was more complicated than either prosecution or defense wanted to acknowledge. Yes, I'd been victimized by Dad's operation, but I'd also been willfully blind to warning signs that should have been obvious to someone with my training. Colonel Garrett, the prosecution began. Please describe your relationship with your father prior to learning about his criminal activities. I talked about childhood, about Dad's pride in my achievements, about the financial support I'd provided, and the professional insights I'd shared. The prosecutor wanted to establish a pattern of normal family interaction to show that Dad had exploited ordinary filial trust for criminal purposes. Did you ever knowingly provide classified information to your father? No. Did you ever authorize him to record your telephone conversations? No. Did you ever give him permission to use your name or position in business dealings with defense contractors? No. But the defense attorney wasn't interested in what I hadn't authorized. During cross-examination, she focused on what I had provided: the money, the introductions, the background information that had given Dad credibility with his clients. You sent your father over $40,000 during the period when he was operating his consulting business, correct? I sent money to help with medical expenses and home repairs. Money that allowed him to maintain the lifestyle and connections necessary to attract clients who believed he had access to classified information. I don't know what he told his clients. But you do know that defense contractors were calling your family home, that your father was attending business dinners with people you didn't recognize, that he was making promises about government connections he claimed to have? My mother mentioned some of that, yes. And despite these warning signs, you continued to provide financial support and professional insights that enabled his operation? This was the trap that congressional hearings were designed to create. Every reasonable action could be reframed as either naive or complicit. Every family loyalty could be portrayed as either admirable or criminal. The hardest part wasn't defending my own actions, it was listening to Dad's testimony when he took the stand. He portrayed himself as a patriotic veteran who'd discovered a way to help American companies better serve their country. In his version of events, I was a willing participant who'd become a victim only when bureaucratic overreach turned legitimate business practices into federal crimes. My daughter understood what we were building, he told the committee. She knew that the information she shared with me was helping American businesses compete more effectively for government contracts. She knew that our family's financial stability was tied to the success of these relationships. It was masterfully done. Dad managed to present himself as both victim and patriot while suggesting that I'd been more involved than I was admitting. He couldn't explicitly accuse me of knowing participation without destroying his own defense, but he could imply that my cooperation had been more conscious than my testimony suggested. Colonel Garrett called me regularly to discuss her work environment, her assessments of Pentagon leadership, her concerns about strategic priorities, he continued. These weren't random conversations. She knew I was using this information to help guide business decisions. The congressional representatives weren't buying it, but the damage to my reputation was incremental and cumulative. Even if the committee concluded that I was primarily a victim, the suggestion of willing participation would follow me for the rest of my career. Mom's testimony was devastating to Dad's defense. She described finding the recording equipment, the business cards with my name, the contracts that explicitly listed me as an intelligence source. She talked about trying to warn me, about Dad's increasing secrecy, about conversations she'd overheard that made clear he was trading on information I'd never authorized him to share. He told these business people that his daughter would take meetings with them, she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. He promised them access to classified briefings, inside information about contract decisions, strategic insights they couldn't get anywhere else. He used her name and reputation to build trust with clients who were paying him for information he was getting by recording her private phone calls. But the most damaging testimony came from Dad's clients, defense contractors who'd paid him for strategic intelligence, who'd received reports that cited me as a direct source, who'd been promised meetings and briefings that were never authorized. One executive testified that Dad had provided detailed intelligence about Eastern European military operations, complete with assessments that could only have come from classified briefings. Another described receiving advance notice about personnel changes at the Pentagon, information that had helped his company position itself for upcoming contract opportunities. Mr. Garrett presented himself as a former military officer with ongoing access to current intelligence, the executive testified. He specifically stated that his daughter was providing him with briefing materials, strategic assessments, and advance notice about contract opportunities. We paid him for access to information we believed was coming directly from active Pentagon personnel. The money trail was undeniable. Dad had received payments totaling nearly $300,000, more than the investigators had initially discovered, in exchange for intelligence reports that cited me as their source. He'd created an entire business model around my position, my clearance, my reputation. The committee's final report was unequivocal about Dad's guilt, but more ambiguous about my role. I was described as an unwitting victim of sophisticated manipulation by a family member who exploited trust and affection for criminal purposes. But the report also noted that I'd failed to recognize warning signs that should have been apparent to someone with extensive intelligence training. Dad was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for espionage, conspiracy, and fraud. The judge noted during sentencing that his exploitation of family relationships for criminal purposes represented a particularly egregious breach of trust that had endangered national security operations. But the legal resolution didn't address the personal devastation. My security clearance was permanently revoked, ending my military career and my access to the intelligence community that had been my professional home for 2 decades. The Pentagon offered me a non-classified administrative position that felt like charity, which I declined. Instead, I took early retirement, accepting the diminished pension that came with 20 years of service rather than the full career I'd planned. I moved away from Washington, away from the colleagues who would always wonder what I'd really known, away from the career that had been destroyed by someone who claimed to love me. The worst part wasn't the professional consequences or even the public humiliation. It was the realization that every expression of pride Dad had ever shown in my achievements had been calculated. Every request for support had been manipulation. Every conversation had been a transaction in a business model that turned family relationships into commodities. He'd spent 2 years systematically betraying me while I'd spent those same 2 years trying to help him feel important, trying to share my professional world with someone I'd trusted completely. The asymmetry was almost harder to bear than the actual espionage. When I visited him in federal prison 6 months after his sentencing, he was still convinced that he'd been right to exploit my position, still believed that family loyalty should have trumped national security, still certain that I would eventually understand that everything he'd done had been for our mutual benefit. "You'll get past this," he told me through the reinforced glass that separated us. "You're strong enough to rebuild. And when you do, you'll see that what we had was special, that the bond between father and daughter is stronger than any government regulation." But what we'd had wasn't special. It was exploitation disguised as love, manipulation presented as family loyalty, betrayal wrapped in the language of pride and support. I never visited him again. The job market for former intelligence officers with revoked security clearances was smaller than I'd expected. Most defense contractors wouldn't return my calls, and the few civilian companies that interviewed me were more interested in the notoriety than the expertise. After 6 months of rejection letters and awkward conversations, I took a position with a small risk assessment firm that specialized in corporate security. Work that used some of my analytical skills, but felt like a significant step down from briefing generals about international threats. My new colleagues were professional but distant. They knew my story, had read the news coverage, had their own opinions about whether I'd been naive or complicit. I didn't blame them for their caution. In their position, I would have had questions too about someone whose career had ended in congressional hearings and espionage convictions. The work was intellectually unchallenging but emotionally manageable. I analyzed corporate vulnerabilities, assessed security risks for executives traveling internationally, prepared briefings for business leaders who needed to understand political instability in emerging markets. It was intelligence work stripped of its strategic importance, analysis without consequences that mattered beyond quarterly earnings reports. But slowly, I began to rebuild something that resembled professional respect. My assessments were accurate, my briefings were clear, and my analysis helped clients make better decisions about investments and operations in uncertain environments. Within a year, I was managing my own accounts and earning the kind of trust that had to be built one assignment at a time. The personal rebuilding was more complicated. I'd moved to Richmond, far enough from Washington to avoid running into former colleagues, but close enough to maintain some connection to the world I'd lost. I bought a small house in a neighborhood where nobody knew about congressional hearings or espionage scandals, where I was just another single professional trying to build a life around work and weekend gardening. Mom called regularly, usually on Sunday evenings, to check on my adjustment and share updates about her own life. She'd filed for divorce while Dad was awaiting trial, a decision that had surprised no one except him. After 40 years of marriage, she'd finally acknowledged that his betrayal of me had been the final evidence she needed that he was capable of destroying anyone who got between him and what he wanted. "He keeps writing letters," she told me during one call. "To me, to you, to his lawyer. He wants us to visit, wants to explain everything again, wants us to understand that he was just trying to build something for the family." "Are you going to visit him?" "No," she said immediately. I spent too many years making excuses for his behavior, too many years convincing myself that his intentions were good even when his actions were harmful. I can't do that anymore. This was new for Mom, clarity about Dad's destructive patterns, boundaries that she enforced rather than just discussed. The investigation had given her the same painful education it had given me. Sometimes people you love are capable of betraying you completely while convincing themselves they're acting in your best interests. The hardest conversations were with former colleagues who reached out periodically to check on my welfare. Most were kind but careful, offering sympathy for my situation while maintaining appropriate distance from someone whose security clearance had been revoked for cause. I appreciated their concern but understood their caution. Colonel Martinez called 6 months after my retirement, ostensibly to ask about consulting opportunities, but really to assess whether I'd recovered from the professional trauma. We had coffee in downtown Richmond, neutral territory where neither of us had to worry about appearances or protocols. The consensus is that you were genuinely victimized, he told me. Most people understand that you didn't know what your father was doing, that you were manipulated rather than recruited. But there are questions about judgment. About whether you should have recognized the warning signs earlier, should have been more careful about family communications. These were the questions that followed me everywhere, the suggestion that even if I hadn't been criminal, I'd been negligent in ways that disqualified me from positions requiring exceptional judgment. It was a reasonable concern. Intelligence officers were supposed to recognize manipulation and deception, were trained to identify threats and vulnerabilities. Do you think I should have known? Martinez considered the question carefully. I think you were in an impossible position. Family relationships don't operate according to security protocols. Trust and suspicion can't coexist in the same emotional space. But that was exactly the problem. My training had prepared me to analyze threats from foreign governments, terrorist organizations, criminal networks, not from someone who'd raised me, who claimed to love me, who presented manipulation as family loyalty. The investigation had revealed that Dad's operation was more sophisticated than anyone had initially understood. He'd spent months studying my professional responsibilities, researching my clearance level, identifying the types of information that would be valuable to defense contractors. The recording equipment had been professionally installed, the business development had been systematic, the client relationships had been carefully cultivated. He essentially recruited you as an unwitting asset, Bennett had explained during one of our final interviews. He used standard intelligence techniques, building trust, identifying vulnerabilities, gradually escalating requests, but he did it within a family relationship where those techniques would be invisible. The sophistication was what made it so difficult to recover from psychologically. This hadn't been opportunistic exploitation or impulsive betrayal. Dad had methodically planned to destroy my career for his financial benefit, had spent 2 years implementing a strategy that turned every conversation into an intelligence collection opportunity. Some nights, lying awake in my Richmond house, I would replay conversations from the years before I'd understood what was happening. Phone calls where I'd shared frustrations about difficult assignments, family dinners where I'd mentioned upcoming personnel changes, casual observations about Pentagon politics that I'd thought were just daughter-to-father conversation. Every interaction had been recorded, analyzed, and monetized. Every expression of trust had been exploited. Every moment of family intimacy had been a business transaction. But gradually, I began to understand that recovery didn't require forgetting or forgiving. It required building new relationships based on clearer boundaries, new professional identity based on demonstrated competence rather than inherited trust, new sense of self that wasn't dependent on approval from someone who had never really seen me as separate from his own ambitions. The corporate security work began to feel less like exile and more like opportunity. I was good at analyzing risks, at helping business leaders understand threats they couldn't see, at providing strategic assessments that improved decision-making. Within 2 years, I was promoted to senior analyst and given responsibility for the firm's international operations assessment. It wasn't the Pentagon, but it was meaningful work that used my skills and experience in ways that helped people make better decisions about complex challenges. I was building something new, not the career I'd planned, but one that belonged to me completely, that couldn't be compromised by anyone else's manipulation or betrayal. And slowly, I was learning to trust again. Not quickly, not easily, but with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that even family relationships required verification, that love could coexist with exploitation, that good intentions could mask destructive actions. The scars would always be visible to people who knew my story. The questions about judgment would follow me through any future security clearance investigations. The knowledge that someone I'd trusted completely had been systematically betraying me would always influence how I approached new relationships. But I was surviving. More than surviving, I was building something that felt like recovery, something that resembled the professional competence and personal integrity that had defined me before Dad's operation had destroyed my military career. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was a life that belonged entirely to me, that couldn't be compromised by anyone else's agenda or ambitions. And that felt like its own kind of victory. 5 years after the congressional hearing, I received notification that Dad was eligible for parole. The letter from the Bureau of Prisons included a form asking whether I wanted to provide a victim impact statement for the parole board's consideration. I set it aside for 3 weeks before finally deciding that I had nothing left to say about what he'd done to me. His release would happen with or without my input. More importantly, my recovery had reached the point where his presence or absence in the world felt equally irrelevant to the life I'd built. By then, I was running my own consulting practice, specializing in risk assessment for companies operating in politically unstable regions. The work combined my military intelligence background with business analysis in ways that felt both familiar and entirely new. I was good at it, respected for it, and successful enough to be selective about clients and projects. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dad had destroyed my government career by trying to monetize my expertise, and I'd rebuilt my professional life by properly monetizing that same expertise. The difference was consent, integrity, and the knowledge that every client relationship was transparent and authorized. My reputation in the private sector was based entirely on demonstrated competence rather than inherited access. Clients hired me because my assessments were accurate, my briefings were clear, and my recommendations helped them avoid costly mistakes. No one cared about my security clearance history. They cared about results. Mom had remarried, a development that surprised everyone, including her. Richard was a retired teacher she'd met at a community college art class, someone who treated her with the respect and consideration she'd never received during 40 years with Dad. They lived quietly in a small town outside Norfolk, visiting museums and taking cruises, and enjoying the kind of ordinary happiness that had been impossible when Dad's ambitions dominated every family interaction. "He writes me letters sometimes," she told me during one of our monthly phone calls. "Your father, I mean. From prison. He still thinks I'll come back to him when he gets out, still believes that everything he did was justified by his love for our family." Do you read them? I used to. But they all say the same thing, that he was protecting us, that he was building something for our future, that he was victimized by a government that didn't understand family loyalty. Dad's inability to acknowledge genuine guilt was consistent with everything I'd learned about his psychology during the investigation and trial. He was capable of admitting tactical mistakes, using recording equipment, being too aggressive in his marketing, trusting the wrong business partners. But he couldn't recognize the fundamental betrayal of using family relationships for criminal purposes. In his mind, he remained a patriotic veteran who'd found an innovative way to help his family benefit from the daughter's success, someone who'd been persecuted by bureaucrats who didn't understand the entrepreneurial spirit that made America great. The victim impact statement form remained on my desk for another month before I threw it away. I'd said everything I needed to say during the congressional hearing, and Dad's parole decision would be based on his institutional record and rehabilitation progress, not on my assessment of the damage he'd caused. Besides, the most important impact of his betrayal hadn't been the career destruction or public humiliation. It had been the education about boundaries, about the difference between love and exploitation, about the importance of building relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited obligation. That education had been painful but valuable. I was better at recognizing manipulation now, more careful about trust, more deliberate about the information I shared and the access I provided. These weren't weaknesses, they were professional skills that served me well in a business environment where confidentiality and discretion were essential. I was also better at setting boundaries with clients, family members, romantic partners, and colleagues. The experience with Dad had taught me that some people would always see relationships as opportunities for advancement rather than connections based on genuine affection or respect. I'd learned to identify those people early and manage interactions accordingly. My personal life had stabilized around a small circle of friends who knew my history but judged me based on current behavior rather than past victimization. I was dating someone, a federal prosecutor, who understood the complexities of family betrayal and professional recovery, and we were building something that felt healthy and sustainable. The relationship was different from anything I'd experienced before Dad's betrayal. More cautious, more deliberate, based on demonstrated trustworthiness rather than assumed loyalty. We shared information gradually, built intimacy incrementally, maintained individual autonomy while developing genuine partnership. It was slower than the kind of total trust I'd once given family members, but it was also more resilient, more based on choice than obligation, more likely to survive the kind of challenges that had destroyed my relationship with Dad. Professional recognition came gradually but consistently. I was asked to speak at industry conferences about international risk assessment, was quoted in business publications about emerging security threats, was consulted by government agencies that needed private sector expertise on situations they couldn't analyze internally. The government consulting was carefully managed. I worked only with agencies that didn't require security clearances, on projects that involved public information and open-source analysis. It was a way of serving national interests without recreating the vulnerabilities that had led to my downfall in the military. More importantly, it was proof that I'd rebuilt credibility in ways that couldn't be compromised by anyone else's actions. My current reputation was based entirely on work I'd performed, relationships I'd developed, and results I'd achieved since leaving the Pentagon. No one could exploit it because no one had access to it except through professional relationships I controlled completely. The anniversary of Dad's arrest passed each year with less emotional impact. The first few years, I'd found myself thinking about the timeline, where I'd been when he was recording phone calls, what I'd been doing while he was developing business relationships with defense contractors, how completely unaware I'd been of the operation that was destroying my career. But eventually, those anniversaries became just dates on the calendar. The investigation, the hearing, the career destruction, the family betrayal, all of it was history that had shaped my present, but no longer defined my daily experience. I'd learned something that military training hadn't taught me, that recovery from betrayal was possible, that professional identity could be rebuilt, that family relationships could be ended when they became too destructive to maintain. Most importantly, I'd learned that survival itself was a form of victory. Dad had tried to destroy my career to advance his own interests, had turned family loyalty into criminal exploitation, had convinced himself that my success belonged to him by right of paternal investment. He'd failed. Not just legally, though his conviction and imprisonment were certainly failures, but in his fundamental objective. I'd survived his betrayal, rebuilt my professional life, and created relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited obligation. The woman walking into Pentagon briefings 20 years ago, the woman who'd trusted family completely and maintained boundaries rarely, would probably not recognize the person I'd become. More careful, more selective, more protective of information and access and trust. But also more competent, more resilient, more clear about the difference between love and exploitation. The betrayal had been devastating, but the recovery had been transformative in ways that made me better at everything I did professionally and personally. Dad's parole hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October. I didn't attend, didn't submit a statement, didn't follow the news coverage. By then, his presence or absence in the world felt irrelevant to the life I'd built without him. I was in my office that morning, preparing a risk assessment for a client considering expansion into Eastern European markets, using the same analytical skills that had once briefed generals about international threats. Different venue, different stakes, but the same fundamental work of helping people understand complex challenges and make better decisions. It was work that belonged entirely to me, that couldn't be compromised by anyone else's manipulation or betrayal, that was based on competence I'd demonstrated rather than access I'd inherited. And that felt like the most complete victory possible. I'm closing this chapter, but I want to hear yours. Have you ever had to choose duty over family? Been falsely accused or pressured to stay silent? What boundary do you wish you'd set sooner? If you were in that briefing room, what would you have done? And how did you rebuild trust after a betrayal? Drop your story in the comments. If this hit home, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true stories about boundaries and redemption, and share this with someone who needs it today.